Tonight we are diving deep into the ancient world of Greek mythology, where gods walked among mortals and heroes carved their names into eternity. I hope, wherever you are in the world, you have found a comfortable place to rest, perhaps with a warm drink beside you and the cares of the day beginning to fade. Let me know where you are listening from, whether it is a bustling city or a quiet countryside, a mountain retreat or a coastal town. Get cozy, settle in, and let us begin this journey together through time and myth. Before there were temples reaching toward the heavens, before marble statues stood gleaming in the sun, before poets sang of heroes and their deeds, there was only darkness. Not the darkness we know today, when we close our eyes, or when night falls gently over the land. This was something older, something vast and incomprehensible. The Greeks called it chaos, and chaos was not merely absence or emptiness. It was the yawning void itself, a gaping nothingness that existed before existence had meaning. Chaos was not evil in the way we might understand evil today. It bore no malice, held no grudges, plotted no schemes. Chaos simply was, stretching endlessly in all directions that did not yet exist. There was no up or down, no left or right, no beginning or end. Time itself had not yet been born, and so chaos existed in a state beyond our comprehension, eternal and unchanging, until the moment everything changed. From this primordial void, the first stirrings of creation began to emerge. Not through any conscious design or divine command, but through a process as natural and inevitable as breathing. First came Gaia, the earth herself, vast and patient and enduring. She was not a goddess standing upon the ground, but the ground itself, the foundation of all that would come after. Every mountain that would rise, every valley that would form, every grain of sand and drop of water would be part of her vast body. Then came Tartarus, the deep and dreadful abyss that lay beneath even Gaia's foundations. Tartarus was darkness made place, a pit so profound that it would take an anvil 9 days to fall from the surface of the earth to its depths. It was a place of punishment and imprisonment, waiting empty and silent for the first beings who would be cast into its shadows. And with Gaia and Tartarus came Eros, though not the cherubic infant of later art. This Eros was primordial, the fundamental force of attraction and desire that would bind all things together, the cosmic glue that would make creation possible. These were the first beings, born from chaos without parent or precedent. They were not yet gods as we would come to know them, with personalities and passions, loves and hatreds. They were concepts given form, elements of reality that had to exist before anything else could follow. And from them, the world, as we know it, began to take shape. Nyx emerged from the void, clothed in darkness so absolute that even chaos seemed to recoil before her. She was night itself, not merely the absence of light, but a positive force, a presence that could be felt and feared. Where Nyx passed, shadows deepened and visibility faded. She gave birth to many children, both alone and with Erebus, the darkness of the underworld, who emerged alongside her. Together they brought forth Aether, the pure upper air that would one day be breathed by gods, and Hemera, the day. Here in these first generations, we see the establishment of the most fundamental cycle that would govern all existence. Hemera, the day, was fated from birth to chase her mother, Nyx across the sky for all eternity. When Nyx spread her dark veil over the world, Hera waited patiently at the edge of existence. When Nyx retreated, Hera rushed forward to fill the space she left behind. Neither could ever catch the other, neither could ever rest. This was the first great cycle, the pattern that would be repeated in seasons and generations, in the rise and fall of kingdoms and the lives and deaths of heroes. Gaia, vast and fertile, did not wait long before bringing forth children of her own. From her body, without need of a consort, she gave birth to Uranus, the sky. He was born star, crowned and magnificent, stretching across the heavens to match her breadth below. When Uranus arched over Gaia, covering her completely, the world found its first architecture. Heaven above, earth below, and between them the space where life would flourish. But Uranus was both Gaia's son and her husband, a union that speaks to the alien nature of these first beings. By mortal standards, such a relationship seems impossible, even abhorrent. But these were not mortals, not even truly gods, as later generations would understand divinity. They were forces of nature itself. And nature follows its own laws, makes its own rules, cares nothing for the sensibilities of creatures who do not yet exist. From the union of earth and sky came the Titans, 12 in number, 6 sons and 6 daughters. Each was vast and powerful, embodying aspects of the world that was still taking shape. Oceanus was born first, the great river that encircled the entire world, flowing endlessly back into itself. Coeus came next, representing the axis of heaven around which the constellations turned. Crius followed, the measuring force, the one who would establish the divisions of time and space. Hyperion emerged blazing, the first light before the sun, the promise of illumination. Aepetus appeared, who would become the father of mankind's benefactors and tormentors. And finally came Cronus, youngest of the sons, whose name would become synonymous with time itself and the devouring of all things. The daughters were equally powerful in their own domains. Theia shone with inner radiance, destined to become mother to the sun, moon, and dawn. Rhea embodied the flow and ease of existence, the natural rhythm that would later be disrupted and must be restored. Themis was law itself, not written or spoken, but the fundamental order that underlies all justice. Mnemosyne became memory, the force that allows the past to inform the present, without which there can be no learning, no wisdom, no culture. Phoebe glowed with prophetic light, holding knowledge of things yet to come. And Tethys flowed like her husband Oceanus, the nourishing waters that would sustain all life. These were the elder children, beautiful and terrible in their primordial glory. But Gaia's womb held darker births as well. She gave life to the Cyclopes, 3 brothers of immense size and strength. Brontes brought the thunder, Steropes carried the lightning, and Arges held the brightness of the bolt. Each had but a single eye in the center of his forehead, gleaming with an inner fire that spoke of the forge and the furnace. They were craftsmen beyond compare, capable of creating wonders that even the gods would covet. And then came the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers even more fearsome than the Cyclopes. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges emerged from Gaia's depths, each with 50 heads sprouting from massive shoulders and 100 arms extending from their torsos. Their appearance was so shocking, so fundamentally wrong by any aesthetic standard, that even Uranus, who had sired them, recoiled in horror and disgust. It was this disgust that would set in motion the first great crime, the first betrayal, the first usurpation. Uranus looked upon the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires and saw not children but abominations. He feared their strength, hated their appearance, and could not bear the sight of them. So he took these youngest children and thrust them back into Gaia's womb, forcing them down into the darkness of Tartarus, where they would be hidden from his sight. Gaia groaned under the weight of her imprisoned children. The pain was immense, unrelenting, a constant ache that grew worse with each passing age. She had given birth to these beings, had brought them forth from her own substance. And now they were trapped within her once more, crying out in the darkness where no one could hear them. Her suffering turned to anger, and her anger demanded justice. In the hidden places of the earth, Gaia forged a weapon from her own substance. It was a great sickle, not of bronze or iron, for such metals did not yet exist, but of adamant, a material harder than diamond and sharper than any blade that would ever be created by mortal hands. She called her Titan children together and laid before them the truth of their father's crime. She showed them the sickle and asked which among them had the courage to strike the blow that justice demanded. The older Titans hung back, fearful of their father's power and the consequences of rebellion. Oceanus, vast as he was, would not raise his hand against the sky. Hyperion, bright though he burned, lacked the will to dim his father's light. One by one they refused, until only Cronus remained, the youngest son, the last born of the Titans, looked at the sickle and then at his mother's anguished face. He reached out and took the weapon in his hand. Gaia instructed him where to hide and when to strike. She knew her husband's habits, knew the patterns of his descent. Each night Uranus came down from the heights of heaven to blanket the earth, to press himself against Gaia in an embrace that was both cosmic and intimate. On the appointed night, Gaia spread herself ready as always, and Uranus descended unsuspecting. But Cronus lay in wait, hidden in the shadowed places where sky meets earth. When Uranus was most vulnerable, when he had given himself over completely to the act of union, Cronus struck. The sickle flashed in the darkness, and in one swift, terrible motion severed Uranus from his power. The sky screamed, a sound that echoed across all of existence, the first cry of true pain the universe had ever known. He pulled away from Gaia, rising back into the heights, but he was diminished now, reduced, no longer the all-encompassing force he had been. Cronus took the severed flesh and cast it away from him in disgust. Some say he threw it into the sea, others that he scattered it across the land. Where it fell upon the earth, the blood soaked into Gaia's soil and gave birth to new beings. The Erinyes emerged, the Furies, three sisters, whose sole purpose would be to hunt down and punish those who committed crimes against family. They were born from violence and would forever after be the instruments of violent justice. The giants rose as well, enormous warriors who would one day wage war against the gods themselves. And the Malaya sprang forth, nymphs of the ash tree whose wood would be used to make the spears of heroes. But the most significant birth came from the portion that fell into the sea. The divine flesh struck the waves and began to dissolve, creating a foam that glowed with an otherworldly light. This foam drifted on the currents, growing and coalescing, until finally it washed ashore on the island of Cyprus. From the foam stepped a figure of such breathtaking beauty that the very air seemed to shimmer around her. This was Aphrodite, born not from a mother's womb, but from an act of violence, from the severed sexuality of the sky itself. She would become the goddess of love and desire, of beauty and passion, and her birth from such a terrible act would forever link love with pain, pleasure with violence, creation with destruction. Uranus, wounded and diminished, rose to the farthest reaches of the sky, where he remains to this day, distant and cold and remote. But before he departed, he spoke a prophecy. His words rang out clear despite his pain, a curse and a prediction wrapped together. He told Cronus that just as the son had overthrown the father, so too would Cronus be overthrown by his own son. It was not a threat, but a statement of fact, a pattern that had been established and would repeat. The cycle of succession had begun, and it would not end with Cronus. With Uranus gone and Cronus ascendant, the age of the Titans began in earnest. Cronus took the throne of the cosmos and claimed dominion over all that existed. He was not as cruel as his father had been, not as oppressive or fearful. He ruled with a firmer hand, but also a more just one. Under his reign, the world flourished. The Titans spread out across creation, each taking their own domains and responsibilities. Oceanus flowed around the world's edge. Hyperion climbed the heights to bring light. Before the sun existed, Theia shone beside him, and the others found their places in the grand design. Cronus took his sister Rhea as his wife, and their union should have been a happy one. Rhea was gentle and nurturing, the perfect complement to her husband's strength. For a time, there was peace. The Titans governed well. The earth blossomed under their care, and it seemed that perhaps the violent pattern established by Uranus had been broken. But prophecies, once spoken, do not fade. They linger like smoke in the air, waiting for the moment when they will ignite into flame. When Rhea became pregnant with their first child, Cronus felt the first stirrings of the fear that would come to dominate his reign. He remembered his father's words, remembered the prophecy of the son overthrowing the father. At night he dreamed of a figure rising from the shadows, young and strong and terrible, coming to cast him down as he had cast down Uranus. The dreams grew worse with each passing night until fear consumed him entirely. When Rhea gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hestia, Cronus held the infant in his great hands. He looked into her newborn eyes and saw not his daughter but his doom. And so, without ceremony or hesitation, without allowing himself time to reconsider, he opened his mouth and swallowed the child whole. Rhea screamed and reached for her baby, but it was too late. Hestia was gone, trapped in the darkness of her father's belly, neither dead nor truly alive, suspended in a terrible limbo. Rhea wept, but Cronus was unmoved. He told himself it was necessary, that he was protecting his throne and his power. He convinced himself that this was different from what Uranus had done, that he was acting not from disgust but from necessity. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. He had become what he had rebelled against. The cycle continued. When the second child came, a daughter named Demeter, Cronus swallowed her as well. Rhea's pleas meant nothing to him now. Fear had hardened his heart completely. The third child, Hera, beautiful and regal even as an infant, met the same fate. The fourth, Hades, solemn and dark-eyed, was consumed without hesitation. And the fifth, Poseidon, strong and willful, struggled in his father's grip before disappearing down his throat. 5 children swallowed, 5 futures stolen, 5 lives trapped in eternal darkness. Rhea's grief was beyond measure. She had carried each child within her, had felt them move and grow, had brought them forth into the world with hope and love. And one by one, her husband had devoured them all. She could not let it happen again. When she felt the 6th child quickening in her womb, Rhea knew she had to act. She could not bear to lose another baby to her husband's fear. She went to her mother Gaia, the ancient earth who had orchestrated the downfall of Uranus. Gaia, who understood a mother's pain better than anyone, listened to Rhea's tears and formulated a plan. As the time of birth approached, Rhea left the halls where Cronus held court. She traveled far from his sight, to the island of Crete, to a cave on Mount Ida where the air was sweet with wild flowers and the sound of running water echoed off stone walls. There, attended by nymphs and watched over by Gaia herself, Rhea gave birth to her 6th child, a son. She named him Zeus. The infant was different from the moment of his birth. His eyes opened immediately, focused and aware in a way that no newborns should be. When he cried out, thunder rumbled in the distance though the sky was clear. When he grasped his mother's finger, she felt a strength that promised greatness. This child would not be swallowed. This child would survive. Gaia had prepared for this moment. She took a large stone, roughly the size and shape of a swaddled infant, and wrapped it in blankets. Rhea returned to Cronus, carrying the bundle, her face arranged in resignation and sorrow. She told her husband that another child had been born, another threat to his throne, and she handed him the wrapped stone. Cronus, so consumed by his fear that he did not think to look, did not pause to examine what he held, opened his mouth and swallowed the stone whole. It sank down into his belly, where it settled among his imprisoned children. And he was satisfied, believing he had once again forestalled his prophesied doom. But on Crete, in a cave fragrant with earth and growth, Zeus thrived. The nymphs cared for him with tender devotion. The goat Amalthea nursed him with milk so rich and nourishing that he grew strong beyond any normal measure. Warriors called the Curetes danced outside the cave, clashing their spears against their shields, so that the sound would drown out the infant's cries, lest Cronus somehow hear and discover the deception. Zeus grew rapidly, as divine children do, within a short span of time. He had become a young man, beautiful and powerful, his eyes flashing with barely contained lightning. Gaia came to him and told him the truth of his birth, the fate of his siblings, and the prophecy that hung over his father. She told him what must be done, and Zeus listened with a growing fire in his heart. The time had come for the cycle to turn once more. The son would face the father. The old order would be challenged by the new, and the universe held its breath, waiting to see which way the balance would fall. When Zeus was fully grown, strong and ready, he left his cave sanctuary and made his way to his father's court. He did not come in war at first, but in disguise, playing the part of a cup-bearer who would serve the Titan king. Cronus, arrogant in his supposed security, did not recognize the young god standing before him. With the help of Metis, the tightness of wisdom, and cunning thought, Zeus prepared a special drink. Some say it was a simple emetic. Others claim it was a potion crafted from the most ancient herbs in Gaia's keeping. Whatever its composition, Zeus presented it to his father in a golden cup. Cronus, feeling festive and secure, drank deeply without suspicion. The effect was immediate and violent. Cronus's belly convulsed, his throat worked, and suddenly he was vomiting forth everything he had swallowed all those years ago. First came the stone, which would later be set up at Delphi as a monument to Zeus's victory. Then, one by one, came the children. Hestia emerged first, no longer an infant but fully grown, goddess of the hearth and home. Demeter followed, bringing with her the scent of grain and growing things. Hera stepped forth regal and terrible in her beauty. Hades came wrapped in shadows that clung to him like a cloak. And finally Poseidon, with the smell of the sea salt still in his hair. They stood together for the first time. 6 siblings born of Titans, but belonging to a new order. They looked at their father, and they looked at each other, and without words they understood what must come next. Cronus, recovering from his sickness, saw them assembled and knew immediately that his worst fear had been realized. The prophecy was unfolding before his eyes. He called out to his brothers and sisters, the other Titans who had ruled alongside him through the long age of their supremacy. Some came to his aid immediately, loyal to blood and tradition. Oceanus alone refused, retreating to his river, realm, and taking no part in what would follow. Hyperion came blazing, ready to dim the light of these upstart gods. Iapetus brought his sons. Crius marshaled forces from the north. The battle lines were drawn. Thus began the war that would later be called the Titanomachy, the great clash between the old gods and the new. It was not a brief conflict, not a single battle, or even a series of skirmishes. It raged for 10 full years, shaking the foundations of the world with every clash of divine powers. Mountains were torn from their roots and hurled like stones. Seas boiled and froze and boiled again. The sky itself cracked and bled light. The Titans established their stronghold on Mount Othrys in Thessaly, a peak that had stood since the world's shaping. The younger gods took Mount Olympus for their fortress, a higher peak to the north, and from these 2 mountains the war was waged. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The Titans had age and experience, power that had been tempered over eons of rule. The younger gods had vigor and fury, the strength of youth, and the righteousness of the oppressed. Year after year the stalemate continued. Zeus hurled lightning, but Hyperion's light pushed it back. Poseidon raised tidal waves, but Oceanus's waters absorbed them. Hades sent darkness creeping across the battlefield, but it could not fully encompass beings who had existed before darkness had a name. The war seemed as though it might continue forever, or until the world itself broke under the strain. It was Gaia who finally shifted the balance. She came to Zeus and his siblings and told them of weapons and allies they had not yet claimed. Deep in Tartarus, imprisoned since the beginning of time, were the Cyclopes and Hecatonchires. If Zeus could free them, if he could gain their gratitude and their service, the war might yet be won. Zeus and his siblings descended into the depths, past the roots of mountains, past the places where water turns to stone, down to the iron gates of Tartarus itself. They shattered the locks that Uranus had forged and Cronus had maintained. And they called out to the prisoners within. The Cyclopes emerged first, blinking in the dim light, their single eyes adjusting after an eternity of darkness. Behind them came the Hecatonchires, unfolding their 100 arms and shaking their 50 heads. The Cyclopes knelt before Zeus, their liberator, and pledged their service. They were master craftsmen, and they set immediately to work. For Zeus they forged the thunderbolt, a weapon of such power that it could shatter mountains and turn sand to glass. For Poseidon they created the trident, which could command the seas and shake the earth. For Hades they fashioned the helm of darkness, which would render its wearer invisible and strike fear into the hearts of any who felt its presence. The Hecatonchires needed no gifts of weapons. They were weapons themselves, each hand capable of hurling boulders the size of houses, each head capable of independent thought and strategy. They emerged from their prison with a rage that had been building for countless ages, and they promised Zeus that they would repay Cronus for every moment of their suffering. The tide of the war turned. Zeus, wielding his thunderbolt, was a force of nature, striking down titans with bolts of pure destructive power. Poseidon raised earthquakes and tsunamis that battered the defenses of Othrys. Hades moved unseen among the enemy, sowing confusion and terror. And the Hecatonchires were like a storm of stone, hurling mountain peaks at the Titan forces, with their 100 hands working in terrifying coordination. The final battle was cataclysmic. The very fabric of existence seemed to tear under the assault of so much concentrated divine power. Cronus himself fell before Zeus, struck down by his own son just as he had struck down his own father. The other titans who had sided with him were overwhelmed, defeated, driven to their knees. But Zeus did not kill them. Perhaps he remembered the lesson of his father's cruelty. Perhaps he understood that to slaughter his own blood would be to invite the same curse that had haunted Cronus. Instead, he bound them in chains forged by the Cyclopes, chains that could never be broken or rusted. He cast them down into Tartarus, to the same prison where the Hecatonchires had suffered for so long. There they would remain, locked in darkness, their age of rule brought to an end. Not all the titans fought for Cronus. Oceanus, as mentioned, had remained neutral and was allowed to keep his watery realm. Themis, who represented justice itself, had seen the righteousness in the younger gods' cause and sided with them. Prometheus, son of Iapetus, had possessed the foresight to know which way the war would turn and had offered his counsel to Zeus. These few were pardoned, allowed to keep their positions and their dignity. The war was over. The old order had fallen. And now the victors stood upon Olympus and looked out over a world that was theirs to reshape. But first they had to decide how it would be divided, how power would be distributed among them. They were siblings, yes, but they were also gods with their own ambitions and desires. Zeus proposed a solution that would satisfy honor while acknowledging the reality of power. They would cast lots, leaving the division to fate rather than force. 3 realms needed rulers: the sky and upper world, the sea and all waters, and the underworld where the dead would dwell. The earth itself would remain common ground, accessible to all, belonging to none exclusively. The lots were cast, and fate spoke. Zeus drew the sky, becoming lord of the air and weather, king of the gods by virtue of his realm's supremacy. Poseidon drew the sea, becoming master of all waters, whether salt or fresh, calm or tempestuous. And Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, a kingdom as vast as either of his brothers' domains, but shrouded in darkness and silence. Some say Hades was disappointed with his lot. Others claim he accepted it without complaint, understanding that every realm needed a ruler, and that his was no less important than his brothers. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the complexity of divine motivation. Hades would rule the dead with stern justice, never leaving his realm, never seeking the worship and glory that his brothers enjoyed. His would be a lonely crown, but he would wear it without complaint. The sisters too found their places in the new order. Hestia, the eldest, asked only for a small honor. She would tend the hearth fires of Olympus and of every home in the world. She sought no grand adventures, no romantic entanglements, no dramatic myths. Her power was in presence, in the warmth and safety of the home. Demeter took dominion over the harvest and the grain, making herself indispensable to mortal and immortal alike. Hera, proud and powerful, claimed her position as queen, standing beside Zeus as his wife and equal, though their relationship would prove to be anything but peaceful. The age of the Olympians had begun. The gods took their thrones and began to establish the order that would govern the cosmos for ages to come. They were not perfect rulers, not by any measure. They were passionate and petty, loving and vengeful, wise and foolish by turns. They were, in many ways, humanity writ large, with all the nobility and all the flaws that implies. Zeus sat upon his throne atop Olympus and surveyed his kingdom. The sky stretched above him, filled with clouds that answered to his will. Below lay the earth, fertile and waiting, and all around him stood his family, his allies, his court. He had won the throne through courage and cunning, through violence and vision. But keeping it, he would discover, would prove far more difficult than winning it had been. For even as the gods celebrated their victory, even as they divided the world among themselves and began to establish their cults and temples, the seeds of future conflicts were already being sown. Prophecies still echoed in the halls of fate. Children would be born who would challenge their parents. Mortals would rise who would dare to compare themselves to the divine, and in the depths of Tartarus, the Titans sat in their chains and remembered and waited, and whispered promises of revenge that would echo through eternity. But those were troubles for another day. For now, there was celebration on Olympus. The gods raised their cups of nectar and ambrosia and toasted their victory. Music filled the halls as Apollo, not yet born but soon to come, would one day take his place among them. The foundation had been laid, the stage had been set, and the great drama of gods and mortals was about to truly begin. The world below was changing as well. The long war had scarred the earth, but Gaia was already healing those wounds. Mountains settled into new configurations, rivers found new courses, and in the valleys and plains, something new was stirring. Life was becoming more complex, more varied, more interesting. Plants spread and diversified. Animals emerged from the seas and took to the land. And soon, very soon, there would come the creature that would fascinate and frustrate the gods more than any other. Humanity was approaching. Though the dawn of mankind was still a few steps away in our tale, first came the divine court in full. Zeus and his siblings were powerful, but a court of 6 is a small and lonely thing. Other gods began to emerge, some born of the Olympians themselves, others rising from the primordial forces that still coursed through creation. Each brought their own domain, their own personality, their own complications to the divine hierarchy. Athena came into being in a manner as strange as any birth in myth. Zeus had taken Metis, the tightness of wisdom, as his first wife. She had helped him in the war, guided him through the complexities of strategy and politics. But even Zeus was not immune to the curse of prophecy. He learned that Metis was destined to bear a son who would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown Cronus, just as Cronus had overthrown Uranus. The pattern threatened to repeat once more. Rather than wait for his doom, Zeus acted. He swallowed Metis whole, trapping her within himself, just as his father had trapped his children. He thought this would end the threat, but he had not counted on the nature of wisdom. Wisdom cannot be digested or destroyed. It persists, it adapts, it finds a way. Inside Zeus, Metis set to work. She could not escape, but she could create. She fashioned armor and weapons, forging them in the furnace of the god-king's thoughts. And she shaped a child, not the prophesied son, who would overthrow Zeus, but a daughter who would serve and protect him. The work took its toll on Zeus. He began to suffer terrible headaches, pains that even nectar could not ease. His skull felt as though it would split apart from the pressure within. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Zeus called for Hephaestus, the smith god, and ordered him to strike. Hephaestus raised his axe and brought it down upon his father's brow. The skull cracked open, and from the wound sprang Athena, fully grown and fully armed. She emerged wearing a helmet of gold, carrying a spear and shield, her grey eyes flashing with intelligence and purpose. She let out a war cry that shook Olympus, and every god assembled there knew immediately that something significant had been born. Athena became the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, where Ares would later embody the chaos and bloodlust of battle. Athena represented warfare as craft, as planning, as the application of intelligence to conflict. She was a virgin goddess, pledging never to marry or bear children, focusing all her passion on the pursuit of wisdom and the protection of heroes who earned her favor. Zeus loved her deeply, this daughter who had come from his own mind, and he gave her privileges granted to no other child. Apollo and Artemis came next, twins born under difficult circumstances. Their mother was Leto, a tightness of gentle disposition, who had caught Zeus's wandering eye. Zeus's affairs were many and varied, and each one drove Hera into fits of jealous rage. But her fury at Leto was particularly intense, perhaps because Leto's children would be so powerful and important. Hera, in her vindictive rage, decreed that Leto could not give birth on any land under the sun. She sent the serpent Python to pursue the pregnant Titaness, driving her from place to place as her time drew near. Every island and continent turned Leto away, fearing Hera's wrath. Only the floating island of Delos, which was not technically fixed land, agreed to provide sanctuary. There, clinging to a palm tree in her labor pains, attended by all the goddesses except Hera and her daughter Eileithyia, who controlled childbirth, Leto finally brought forth her children. First came Artemis, and she was born so quickly and with so little difficulty that she was able to assist her mother in delivering Apollo. The twins were beautiful beyond measure, and from their birth they possessed powers that marked them as among the most important of the Olympians. Artemis claimed the wilderness as her domain, roaming with a bow and a band of virgin huntress companions. She was the protector of young girls, the goddess of the moon, fierce and independent. Apollo took the sun as his crown, though Helios the Titan still drove the solar chariot for now. He became the god of music, poetry, prophecy, healing, and plague. His oracle at Delphi would become the most important in the Greek world, the place where mortals came to seek guidance from the divine. Ares was born of Zeus and Hera, their legitimate son who should have been a source of pride. Instead, he became something of a disappointment to both parents. He embodied war in its most brutal form, the clash of armies, the screaming chaos of the battlefield, the blood-soaked earth where heroes fell. But unlike Athena, who fought with purpose and strategy, Ares seemed to love war for its own sake. He gloried in violence without asking whether the cause was just. The other gods found him unpleasant, and even his own parents kept their distance. Only Aphrodite seemed to appreciate him, though their relationship would cause scandals that echoed through the ages. Hephaestus had a birth as troubled as his nature would prove to be. Some say he was the son of Zeus and Hera, born of their legitimate union, but deformed from birth. Others claim Hera birthed him alone, without a father, in retaliation for Zeus producing Athena from his own head. Whatever the truth of his parentage, Hephaestus was born twisted and lame, his legs bent, his gait awkward, his appearance unpleasing to divine eyes that valued beauty above almost all else. Hera, ashamed of having produced such a child, threw him from Olympus. He fell for a day and a night, finally crashing into the ocean far below. He should have died from such a fall, but gods are hard to kill. Instead, he was rescued by Thetis and Eurynome, sea nymphs who took pity on the broken god child. They raised him in a grotto beneath the waves, and their Hephaestus discovered his gift. His hands, though attached to a crooked body, could create wonders. He became a smith beyond compare, crafting jewelry and weapons and automatons that moved of their own accord. When he finally returned to Olympus, he came not as a supplicant, but as an artist whose services were invaluable. He built the palaces of the gods, forged their weapons, created marvels that made even Zeus pause in wonder. And in a famous act of revenge, he crafted a golden throne for his mother, beautiful and irresistible. When Hera sat upon it, golden chains sprang forth and bound her fast. No god could free her. No amount of pleading or threatening could make the chains release. Only Hephaestus held the secret of their opening. and he refused to return to Olympus until Dionysus got him drunk and coaxed him back. He freed his mother, but the message was clear. The cast-off child had made himself indispensable. Aphrodite's place on Olympus was secure from the moment of her birth from the sea foam. Beauty such as hers commanded immediate respect and attention, but her presence brought complications. The gods vied for her attention, each wanting to claim her as wife. Zeus, to prevent conflict among the other gods, made a decision that seemed practical, but would lead to endless trouble. He gave Aphrodite in marriage to Hephaestus. On the surface, this made a kind of sense. Hephaestus was loyal, hard-working, and unlikely to inspire jealousy from the other gods. But to marry the goddess of beauty and desire to the lame smith was to guarantee unhappiness. Aphrodite felt trapped in a marriage she had not chosen, bound to a husband she could not love, at least not in the passionate way her nature demanded. She sought comfort and excitement elsewhere, most notably in the arms of Ares, and their affair became the subject of many tales. Hermes came into the world already moving. He was born in a cave on Mount Selene, son of Zeus and the nymph Maia. By noon of his first day, he had escaped his cradle and was exploring the world. By evening, he had invented the lyre by stretching strings across a tortoise shell. By midnight, he had stolen 50 cattle from Apollo's sacred herd, driving them backward so their hoofprints led in the wrong direction. When Apollo discovered the theft and tracked the impossible trail to the cave where the newborn Hermes lay, appearing innocent in his swaddling clothes, the sun god was both furious and impressed. Zeus was called to mediate the dispute between his sons. Hermes, with a perfectly straight face, denied everything. But when Apollo began to provide evidence, Hermes suddenly produced the lyre and began to play music so beautiful that Apollo forgot his anger. The two gods struck a bargain. Apollo would forgive the theft in exchange for the lyre, and Hermes would become the herald of the gods, the messenger who could move between all realms, the guide of souls, the patron of thieves and travelers and anyone who crossed boundaries. The Olympian court was nearly complete. 12 thrones stood in the great hall, though the final seat would remain contested for some time. The number 12 seemed right, significant, a symbol of completeness and order. But divine families, like mortal ones, are rarely simple or stable. There were others with claims to Olympus, others who would make their mark on the mythic landscape. Dionysus would eventually claim the 12th throne, but his path to Olympus was long and strange, and his story touches on mysteries that we will return to later. For now, let us turn our attention from the heights of Olympus to the earth below, where another act of creation was about to unfold. The gods had their court, their palaces, their domains. But a kingdom without subjects is a lonely thing, and the gods desired worship, attention, beings who would look up at Olympus with awe and offer sacrifices in gratitude and fear. The world was full of life already. Animals of every kind roamed the earth, swam the seas, flew through the air. But none of these creatures could truly appreciate the gods, could build temples or compose hymns or tell stories that would preserve divine glory. What was needed was something new, a creature that stood between the beasts and the gods, capable of reason and art and worship. What was needed was humanity. The creation of mankind did not happen all at once, nor was there universal agreement about how it should be done. Different accounts place the act at different times and credit different creators. But the most famous story involves Prometheus, the Titan who had foreseen Zeus's victory and sided with the Olympians during the war. Prometheus was a complex figure, difficult to categorize neatly. His name meant forethought, and he possessed the ability to see possibilities branching out into the future. He was not always right in his predictions, but he was right often enough to have earned a reputation for wisdom. He was also, by nature, a champion of the underdog, a defender of those weaker than himself. These traits would bring him both to his greatest triumph and his most terrible punishment. Some say Prometheus shaped mankind from clay beside a river in Arcadia, mixing earth and water until he had formed figures roughly in the shape of the gods themselves. Upright walkers, with hands that could grasp and manipulate, with faces that looked forward rather than down, with minds that could hold thoughts of past and future. He breathed life into these clay forms, and they became the first humans, weak and vulnerable, but possessing a spark of something special. Others say humanity emerged more gradually, evolving from lesser creatures or arising spontaneously from Gaia's fertile soil. But however they came to be, the early humans were pitiful creatures. They had no fur to keep them warm, no claws or fangs to defend themselves, no speed to escape predators. They cowered in caves, ate raw food, and died in droves to cold and wild beasts. They were intelligent enough to know their predicament, but lacked the tools to improve it. Prometheus looked upon humanity with pity. He saw in them potential, possibilities waiting to be unlocked. But they needed help, needed gifts that would level the playing field between themselves and the harsh world around them. Prometheus went to Olympus and petitioned Zeus to grant humanity some advantage, some tool that would allow them to flourish. But Zeus, for reasons of his own, refused. The king of gods was cautious about humanity. He saw in them the seeds of possible rebellion. They were made in the image of the divine, possessed minds that could question and challenge. If they became too powerful, too capable, they might pose a threat. Better to keep them weak, dependent, always aware of their inferior position. Let them struggle and survive if they could, but do not give them the means to rival the gods. Prometheus disagreed. He believed humanity deserved better, that their potential should be nurtured rather than suppressed. And so, he made a decision that would have consequences echoing through eternity. If Zeus would not give humanity the tools they needed, Prometheus would steal those tools himself. Fire was the province of the gods. It burned in the forges of Hephaestus, blazed in the hearth of Hestia, crackled in the thunderbolts of Zeus himself. It was divine, transformative, the element that separated civilization from savagery. With fire, humans could cook food, making it safer and more nutritious. With fire, they could warm themselves through the winter, expanding the range of climates they could inhabit. With fire, they could work metal, create tools and weapons, defend themselves against predators. Fire was knowledge, technology, progress. Fire was power. Prometheus ascended to Olympus in secret. He entered the forge of Hephaestus and took a hollow fennel stalk. Then, when no one was watching, he stole a spark from the divine fire and hid it within the stalk. He carried this spark down from Olympus to earth, moving quickly before it could be discovered. And there, in the gathering darkness, he gave fire to humanity. The reaction was immediate and transformative. Humans gathered around the flames, feeling warmth for the first time, seeing the darkness pushed back. They learned to maintain the fire, to feed it, to move it from place to place. They began to cook their food and found it tasted better, sat easier in their stomachs. They began to experiment, discovering that certain stones, placed in fire, would melt and could be shaped into tools far superior to anything they had possessed before. The Bronze Age was beginning, and with it, human civilization started its long climb towards sophistication. Zeus discovered the theft almost immediately. He looked down from Olympus and saw fires burning across the earth, tiny pinpricks of light that should not exist in the mortal realm. His rage was magnificent and terrible. Prometheus had defied him, had stolen from the gods, had elevated humanity without permission. This could not be allowed to stand unpunished. But Prometheus was not the only target of Zeus's wrath. Humanity too must be taught a lesson, must be shown that defying divine will carry consequences. Zeus called together the gods and commanded them to create something that appeared to be a gift, but was actually a curse. They would fashion a woman, the first woman, and through her, suffering would enter the human world. Hephaestus shaped her from clay, as Prometheus had shaped the first men. Athena dressed her in silvery robes and taught her the arts of weaving. Aphrodite breathed grace and beauty into her, making her irresistible to mortal eyes. Hermes gave her a cunning mind and a persuasive voice. Every god contributed something to her creation. And when they were finished, she was perfect in appearance but dangerous in nature. They named her Pandora, the all-gifted. Zeus presented Pandora to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, whose name meant afterthought, and who lacked his sibling's ability to foresee consequences, despite Prometheus's warnings to accept no gifts from Zeus. Epimetheus was captivated by Pandora's beauty and took her as his wife. With her, Zeus sent a sealed jar as a wedding gift, instructing that it must never be opened. The nature of Pandora remains a subject of debate and interpretation. Was she truly malicious, a weapon deliberately crafted to harm humanity? Or was she simply curious, possessed of a flaw that Zeus knew would lead to disaster? The ancient Greeks themselves were ambivalent, sometimes portraying her as evil, sometimes as tragic, sometimes as simply human in her inability to resist temptation. What is certain is what happened next. Whether from malice or curiosity, or some impulse she could not name, Pandora opened the jar, and from it spilled every form of suffering and evil that would plague humanity for the rest of time. Disease erupted, spreading through the human population, bringing fevers and pain and death. Toil emerged, making work harder, the earth less willing to yield its bounty. Age crept forth, bending backs and weakening limbs. Jealousy, hatred, war, famine, madness. All the evils that had been locked away now flooded into the world. Pandora, realizing what she had done, slammed the jar shut. But it was too late. The evils were loose and could never be recaptured. Only one thing remained in the jar, trapped by the closing lid: hope. The interpretations of this have varied over the centuries. Some say it means that humans are denied even the comfort of hope, that it was the final curse to keep hope trapped away. Others argue that hope remained available, the one good thing preserved, the one comfort that would allow humanity to endure all the suffering that had been unleashed. Prometheus watched these events unfold with growing horror. He had given humanity fire, had given them the means to rise above their limitations. And in punishment, Zeus had cursed them with evils that would make their brief lives full of suffering. But Zeus's punishment for the Titan himself was still to come, and it would be proportionate to the crime. Prometheus had stolen fire, had elevated humanity, had defied the king of gods. For this, his punishment would be eternal. Zeus ordered Prometheus taken to the far eastern edge of the world, to the Caucasus Mountains, where the sun rose each morning. There, Hephaestus reluctantly bound his fellow rebel in chains of adamant, unbreakable and eternal, fixing him to the naked rock face. Prometheus was immortal, incapable of dying, which meant his suffering could continue forever. But chains alone were not sufficient punishment in Zeus's eyes. Each day, an eagle would come to the bound Titan. This eagle, some say born from the monster Typhon, some say created by Zeus himself, would tear open Prometheus's flesh and feast upon his liver. Being immortal, Prometheus would not die from this assault. And each night, his body would heal completely, the flesh knitting back together, the liver regrowing, and each morning, the eagle would return to feed again. This was the punishment for giving humanity hope, for seeing potential in mortal beings that the gods wanted to keep suppressed. Prometheus hung on his rock, screaming curses at Zeus, prophesying the king of gods' eventual fall, but unable to free himself or escape his daily torment. Years stretched into decades, decades into centuries, and still the Titan hung there, still the eagle came each dawn, still the cycle of agony repeated without end. But Prometheus possessed one advantage, one secret that Zeus wanted desperately to know. In his foreknowledge, Prometheus had seen a prophecy concerning Zeus, a prediction that the king of gods would one day father a son more powerful than himself, a son who would overthrow him just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus. But Prometheus also knew the identity of the woman who would bear this child. If Zeus lay with her, he would seal his own doom. If he avoided her, he could rule forever. Zeus demanded this knowledge. He sent Hermes to Prometheus, offering to end his suffering in exchange for the name. But Prometheus, even in his agony, refused. The knowledge was his only leverage, his only power over the god who had condemned him to eternal torment. He would not surrender it, not for any offer Zeus could make. And so the suffering continued, year after year, century after century. The Titan and the king of gods locked in a stalemate that could only end when one finally yielded. We will return to Prometheus and his eventual fate. But for now, let us turn our attention to what happened on Earth, where humanity, despite or perhaps because of Pandora's curse, began to multiply and spread. They built their first settlements, learned agriculture, developed language and art and religion. They looked up at Olympus, shrouded in clouds, and imagined the gods watching them. They built altars and offered sacrifices, hoping to win divine favor, or at least avoid divine wrath. The gods, for their part, found humanity endlessly fascinating. These brief, lived creatures, so much weaker than even the least of the immortals, nevertheless displayed remarkable creativity and courage. The gods began to involve themselves in human affairs, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering, often simply observing, as one might watch an ant farm. They took mortal lovers, producing children who were half divine, half human. These demigods would become heroes, their exploits forming some of the greatest stories ever told. But before we speak of heroes, we must speak of the ages of mankind, the long decline from innocence to iron, from peace to war, from simplicity to sorrow. The poet Hesiod, writing centuries after the events he described, divided human history into 5 ages, each less fortunate than the one before. Whether these ages were literally true or metaphorically significant, they captured something essential about the Greek understanding of time and fate. The first age, the Golden Age, occurred during the reign of Cronus, before the war between Titans and gods. In this time, humans lived like gods themselves. They did not age, did not suffer disease, did not labor. The earth gave freely of its abundance, and men and women lived in harmony with nature and each other. There were no wars, no quarrels, no jealousy or greed. When their time came, they simply fell asleep and did not wake, passing peacefully into death, without pain or fear. These first humans became guardian spirits after their deaths, benevolent demons who watched over their descendants and promoted justice. The Silver Age came next, inferior to the Gold, but still blessed compared to what would follow. These humans lived for 100 years as children, carefree and innocent. But when they finally reached maturity, their adult lives were brief and full of folly. They quarreled among themselves, refused to honor the gods with proper sacrifices, and generally displayed a lack of wisdom that angered Zeus. He destroyed this race and created another. But the spirits of the Silver Age persisted, dwelling beneath the earth as lesser honored dead. The Bronze Age humans were different again. They were not born from trees, but from ash spear shafts, and war was in their nature from the beginning. These were men of terrible power and violence, strong as giants, delighting in battle and conquest. They wore bronze armor, wielded bronze weapons, lived in bronze houses. But they were not evil, merely fierce. They destroyed themselves through constant warfare, wiping out their own race in an endless cycle of violence. They descended to Hades without fame or honor, forgotten even by those who came after. Then came an interruption in the decline, a brief return to glory. This was the age of heroes. The demigods who were greater than the humans who came before and after them. These were the children of gods and mortals, blessed with divine strength or wisdom or beauty. They built great cities, embarked on impossible quests, fought monsters and each other with equal enthusiasm. Some died young in glorious battle. Others lived long lives and were remembered in song and story. A few, the greatest among them, were taken to the Isles of the Blessed after death, there to dwell in eternal happiness, far across the Western Ocean. This was the age of Perseus and Heracles, of Theseus and Jason, of Achilles and Odysseus. Their stories would be told and retold until the names became synonymous with heroism itself. But even this age of glory came to an end. brought low by the greatest war the world had yet seen, the siege of Troy. After Troy fell, after the heroes died or wandered lost across the seas, after the great deeds were done and the songs were sung, a darker age began. The fifth age, the Iron Age, was the age in which Hesiod himself lived, and it was an age of decline and sorrow. Iron Age humans had to work hard for everything they possessed. The earth no longer gave freely, but had to be beaten into submission with plough and spade. Disease and old age ravaged the population. Children no longer respected their parents. Friends betrayed each other. Oaths were broken without shame. Justice fled from the earth, and in her place came violence, greed, and despair. Hesiod prophesied that Zeus would destroy this race as he had destroyed the others, and perhaps fashion another to take their place. Or perhaps, he suggested grimly, the time of humanity was simply coming to an end. But dark though the Iron Age might be, it was during this time that many of the greatest stories took place. For suffering, the Greeks understood breeds heroes. Comfort and ease produce nothing worth remembering. It is in struggle, in adversity, in the face of impossible odds, that human greatness emerges. And so even in this fallen age, there were those who rose above their circumstances, who performed deeds that would echo through eternity. Let us turn now to these heroes, to the demigods and exceptional mortals who bridged the gap between humanity and divinity. Let us begin with Perseus, whose lineage stretched back to Zeus himself, and whose story contains many of the elements that would recur again and again in Greek mythology. Here we find prophecy and attempted prevention, divine aid and mortal courage, monsters vanquished and destinies fulfilled. Thank you for joining me on this portion of our journey through Greek mythology. I hope these stories have transported you, have helped you see the ancient world not as a distant, dead thing, but as a living tradition that still speaks to fundamental human truths. Next time we will continue with the heroes, with Perseus and his quest, with Heracles and his labors, with all the glorious and terrible deeds that made mortals into legends. Until then, may you rest well, may your dreams be pleasant, and may the stories we have shared tonight stay with you like embers that keep their warmth long after the flame has died. Good night.